But we're sticking to the topic of green finance, following up from Johan's presentation. Is, once again, the money the enabler or the disabler? Here to guide our conversation is Michael Bark-Jones from City Law Firm White & Case. Michael and panel, welcome up.
Right, well, it often falls to lawyers to do the graveyard shift, the last talk of the day, but we'll try and keep it as interesting and upbeat as we can. We've got a great panel here today, and we'll get you out for the drinks, hopefully on time, but hopefully some interesting discussion before then. So my name is Michael Bark-Jones. I head up the DCM, the Debt Capital Markets team in the Stockholm office of White & Case, working virtually since the beginning of green finance. And actually worked on SSAB's sustainability-linked bonds, for example, very, very recently. But it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the panel I have here. And if I can start on the far right, on the screen, we have Viveka Hirdman-Ryrberg, even after 8 years, I struggle, who is head of corporate communications and sustainability at Investor AB. The largest industrial holding company in Northern Europe. And then to her left, we have Michael Sheren, who is currently advising acting as senior advisor to the Bank of England, although he makes it quite clear that he's not here in his capacity as advisor to Bank of England. Correct me if I'm wrong, Michael. And then, we have Jonathan Ward to his left, who acts for ClimateView, which is a Swedish-based environmental technological company advising municipalities primarily on sustainability options. And then finally, we have Renato Beltran from SEB, who is based here in London and advises UK corporates quite often on sustainability, I believe. So we don't have too long, so let's get straight into the discussion. Obviously, Johan gave a very good overview of the sustainable finance markets, and we've seen a huge amount in the last 10 years or so of regulation and advances in terms of EU taxonomy, etc. Viveka, if I could just start with you. How do you see the progress of those regulations? Do you see them as helping or hindering, going far enough? Or what is your general view of the current status?
Hello, everyone, and sorry for not being able to be with you in London. I would say, I think they are sometimes too technical and theoretical, but they are necessary. And I also think that to make them work, and we are now just, in the loop from a European perspective with the EU regulations coming up, seeing them going from being, on paper to real, practical. And what we need, I think, is one, more of standardization on a global scale to make them really, really work. We also need global price mechanism on carbon, which we don't have. We need, of course, transparency from the corporate sector, given that we have standards on how to be transparent. And then I would also underline the importance of the fantastic power within the corporate sector, within the business community, through driving innovation, new solutions, as being recognized and being part of the solutions to mitigate climate change.
Thank you. And Michael, what is your view of the regulatory situation we're in now and the solutions that we have in the finance market? Is it sufficient to achieve the Paris goals, or do we need to really move on to give investors more confidence and also corporates the ability to access those markets?
Again, thank you for inviting me, and again, I apologize for not being there. To answer your question, as you may or may not know, I also chaired the G20 group on sustainable finance for several years. And as Vivek said, there's a lot of global activity that needs to keep moving. So short term, right now, you see a tremendous amount of work around TCFD and disclosure, about taxonomies, about a variety of things. However, the regulatory regimes are moving much quicker. You saw China just open up the largest carbon market in the world at the beginning of this year. The OECD just came out in favor of a carbon price, included the G20 ministers, and the IMF just did. And what that makes, it changes the game. It puts a hard number on tons. So if you're a corporation that's out there and they're producing, again, automobiles, you start trying to calculate what you need to do in terms of CapEx, in terms of R&D, to be able to become a more sustainable company. And we were talking beforehand, who would have thought 5 years ago that Volvo and General Motors would become fully electric automobiles? So I think, to answer your question precisely, the regulatory regimes are moving. They've been moving for 5 or 6 years when TCFD started out and the taxonomies came out. However, they're moving quicker. The Bank of England did a stress test on the banking portfolios of the large institutions within the UK. We started asking them about their credit portfolios. We saw the UK is making, every new build home has to have a renewable energy heating as of 2025, and you cannot have, you cannot sell an internal combustion car in the UK as of 2030. So all of a sudden you've got even micro legislation and regulations that are going to have a huge effect on business. So business needs to keep an eye not just on the global, which is essential, but also on the regional, which the EU, and we ever talked about the EU work, but also specifically in places like the UK. So if you've got a building, automobiles, you have to watch those because those regulatory and legislative initiatives are going to have a huge impact on the cash flows, the CapEx, and the R&D in the real economy.
Interesting, thank you. And Jonathan, just looking at it from a slightly different perspective, from the municipalities that you advise and speak to, how are you seeing the market in the UK particularly, but elsewhere, in terms of the ability to access the financial markets and through the regulation, etc.?
Certainly within the Nordic markets and Sweden, people probably know that a lot of cities, municipalities have had climate bonds for several years. Gothenburg and cities we work with, like Umeå, Eskilstuna, part of a larger collective investment, and they've started to align those with ICMA principles. It's getting regulated, but in the UK, it's sort of lagging behind, but there's a lot of progress in the last couple of years. There's a bit of context that collectively UK local authorities are estimated to have sort of £3 billion budget shortfall, and particularly after COVID, and a lot of councils, in order to address capital projects and other things, had diversified, been hit particularly by economic downturn. So when you look at things like climate change, where mitigation work outside of things like transport, etc., is what we call non-statutory, it's been difficult to prioritise finance. And the response to pretty much all of the councils declaring very ambitious targets the last couple of years was to quickly suddenly hit this roadblock of, well, how are we going to pay for that? How are we going to evidence those projects and build the business cases? And so one of the things that's happened over the last year, the core cities, which are the major UK cities outside of London, they first of all put a kind of prospectus together last year saying, well, if £1 billion low carbon cities fund, we could then leverage 10 billion in private investment to get started in key areas like retrofit. That has led to other work with a body called UK 100 and the London councils this year to the launch of the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission in July. And they've estimated that just for those core cities, the net zero plans are worth up to around 330 billion. But as for acquiring that investment, well, one of the things that's been recognised and why cities have come together is a lack of capacity and competency for accessing the capital markets in any one authority, the scale of the projects being suitable for investment, and the evidence base to reduce the inherent sort of risks and uncertainties in it. So it's been a really fast developing area. There's smaller scale innovation happening as well, community municipal investment bonds, a couple of councils use in the UK, but they tend to be ones that are more open to smaller investors. So the variety of reasons in the past why the movement hasn't been towards bonds, and particularly reliance on government funding and public works loans. But now it's certainly looking more outwardly in terms of how to leverage finance, but several issues as to how they then find access to market.
Thank you. Renato, your focus on the UK corporates. How are you seeing their the availability of funds, their ability to access the funds that are out there? You know, we see the UK sovereign bond 10 times oversubscribed. There's a lot of money out there. How are they able to do that at the current moment? Have they got enough projects?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I think like everywhere else, the sustainable finance is evolving in the UK, but it's the same case across markets, and it's the same with corporates as well. And we have seen a lot of the pace has picked up in the last 12, 18 months. So now everybody wants to discuss sustainability, which is great. But you have a mixed bag of corporates and how they achieve, because they have different ways of dealing with the sustainability. Some of them are very focused on asset rotation. Other banks and other corporates are more focused on the pricing itself. But the truth of the matter is that all of them are trying to decide whether they want to pursue a use of proceeds, a green transaction, or a sustainability-linked transaction, as it was mentioned before. But they do have access, and investors are really willing to pick up this paper.
Okay, great, thank you. Michael, I think it was a very interesting comment on the carbon pricing. Is that to you the way forward? Is that what we're really waiting for? Or are there other initiatives that you could see at a policy level which could really propel us forward along the track? I mean, what we're hearing is that there are things stopping the progression towards the speed and to reach the Paris goals.
No, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not a be-all, end-all. But what it does is, and I'm glad somebody brought up, it's kind of the elephant in the room, it's net zero carbon. So you've got all the major economies, whether it's the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, have committed to a net zero carbon generally by 2050. So you've got, if you're modeling out a business model, that's your ending. But you need to start thinking about, well, how do we get my business, and if you're a policy maker, how do I get my economy to that point of view? So putting a price on carbon is an important bit, because you do have you've got a hard stop date, so to speak, on that. So that's important, but that doesn't change innovation. That's absolutely essential. You know, and the great thing is we see so much about, you know, it's moving and changing. I saw a company the other day doing lab-based sushi grade sushi. So, I mean, there's a variety of things that are outside of the regulatory ban. One of the other things that I think is important is the risk analysis within banks. Now, SEB is a world leader in doing this, but a lot of the banks have not done this yet, and the central banks are starting to supervise their ability to quantify the risks. And it's not just the carbon, it's a lot of the other ESG and what we call them free-riding negative externalities tied to business models. I think if you're looking for other areas that need to come in, those are it as well, because obviously, you know, it's like an algebraic equation. It's not just stopping the carbon, because you have to do that, but you still have to look at what your policy is in terms of financing companies that are deforesting, because ultimately, if we don't stop cutting trees and stop carbon, ultimately there's different variables. So I think from the carbon point of view, putting a number on the tax is absolutely essential to give business people a look forward, and in most cases, and when you talk to about this, it'll go in steps. So it might start at 15 or 20 euros per ton and step up over time to 2030 or 2035. But you need to understand what that is and that clarity. And right now, I don't think the real economy participants have that clarity. So I think it's a good first important step.
Interesting, thank you. And Viveka, how do you react to that? How do you see corporates, etc., your investments perhaps reacting to that?
I would say, you know, and we see that increasingly. We are a very long-term owner, so we take the, you know, we want to secure the long-term competitiveness of our companies, i.e., then, you know, to do that, you need to really act now. And as the development of climate is accelerating, you need to even act faster than maybe what you thought as a corporate 1 or 2 years ago. And that means that you need to, you know, move towards a net zero, maybe much faster than the 2050 and so on, because, and you have to also really challenge the way you do things. And we see that companies are doing that. And I think, and from what I know, you have also been discussing over the day today, the way companies are collaborating between themselves in order to, speed up change. And also how digitalization and sustainability, climate, it's really, really integrated, because with increased digitalization, automation, you also can really move forward on reducing the negative climate impact.
Right. And Renato.
And what we see all over, companies are acting. The companies we are involved in, many of them are in the forefront in terms of really setting very ambitious targets, and not only setting the targets on climate, but also delivering on them.
And that's a good point, setting targets and actually meeting them. Renato, in the UK, when you're speaking to your corporates, do you think they are being ambitious enough? Are they being honest about it? Are they really trying for these goals? How do you see it at the moment?
Yeah, no, I think they are trying to be honest. I do think so, in reality. But you see this wave of corporates that everyone is kind of rushing to do the ESG loans. And the main reason for that is that they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to do that. So some of the corporates are better prepared than others. That's very clearly. But some of them is just a matter of timing versus accuracy, and they have to cherry pick which one they want to be on. And there's always like this analogy of a train journey, and these clients, okay, which part of the carriage you want to be? You want to be in first class and be a leader of that one. You can be in second class and be a follower. If you go in the third carriage, then you're going to be basically a standby and just looking and undecided. Or alternatively, you be left in the platform and do nothing. So I think what the corporates are trying to do is everybody's trying to jump onto the train, but at the different carriages at the time being. And some are more ambitious than the others. And this is something that you can see that it's trickling down, I think, from top down, I think, because senior management is getting the pressure coming their way. And that's how it's feeding into the organizations, I guess.
And obviously, SEB, you work in London, but do a lot of corporate work in Sweden as well. Are you seeing a difference between the ambitiousness of the Swedish companies compared to the UK, or? Well,
what we're trying actually to do is to bring the good practice from the Nordics into the UK market, but I think it depends how you define good practice. Because good practice, at least from us into the Nordics, I guess it's probably a mindset or environmental awareness, so it's embedded in them. But, and that's what we're trying to do. So I have to say that we're trying to get that mindset into our corporates, do the things for the right reason, not just a tick on the box, label things. We're not about labeling things. As Johan said before, it's about helping that transition, doing it for the right thing. There will be items that you cannot abate and things like that, but you have to support those clients. But in summary, I think both are benefiting. I can see it with our sustainability colleagues in Sweden, that they're benefiting from some of the learnings in the UK, and maybe just because of the scope of some of the clients as well.
Great, thank you. And Jonathan, how do you see this, for example, the carbon prices or other changes being implemented at the moment affecting the municipalities in the UK and elsewhere? Do you see that as a potential tax windfall for the municipalities, or how do you see that?
Well, I certainly think there's a role to play in bridging the gap we're finding on some of the projects at the moment. And given, people have mentioned the urgency just now, and given the IPCC report this year gave us a 1.5 degree carbon budget of 400 gigatons, and we're using 34 a year. We only have about just over 10 years. So we need things desperately that tip the balance on some of the projects, particularly where things haven't yet scaled, and so those costs are a little bit above the other options in the market. So we see this between, say, moving between heat pumps and gas, etc., that the carbon tax may swing the balance. And it's interesting to talk about carbon taxes, where the value goes. Obviously, the values have been in the European trading systems for many years, and then there was a recent UCL and Cambridge report that talked about the sort of long-term cost of carbon, and estimating up to $3,000 per tonne of the socialised cost. But it's not just carbon tax alone. I think when you work in sort of civil service, etc., you recognise that there's the role for stable and long-term and cross-party commitments. Because there's been lots of projects, say, in retrofit, where municipalities have planned to do a lot of work, but supply chains don't have the confidence that this is going to last, that it's harder to borrow because there isn't a long-term public sector commitment into this. And so the costs become high and people are less willing to scale up the supply chains, etc. So providing regulatory and policy confidence, other market incentives, as well as carbon tax, I think are all got to work together to change that balance, but quickly. So I do think it will make a difference. I just think it's a matter of how quickly we can change that.
Thank you. And Renato, I mean, you sort of mentioned good practices in sustainable finance, and I think the blurb for this talk was actually greenwashing is a thing of the past. I just wanted to get your views on whether that was true. I mean, you can see with the UK sovereign bond already, it's being criticised for just financing things which would be done anyway. For example, sustainability-linked bonds are being criticised for being too loose. And yet, at the infancy of the green market, basically, the idea was to keep it loose so that to bring companies in and give them the ability to do it without having to just making it too expensive and too onerous to actually issue green bonds, for example. So just be interested to know what your thoughts on the greenwashing are, and whether there needs to be some relaxation there just to allow enough companies to come to market without making it prohibitive. Renato, since you brought up good practices.
Well, yeah, no, I think that there's definitely less greenwashing nowadays. I think people are getting smarter. They're getting the pressure from investors and all stakeholders. So the eyes are on the ball, effectively. So people have to be very cautious what they do. People are taking more seriously, definitely. I think you cannot relax the standards because then you open the gates. So I think Viveka was mentioning about regulation, which I think you have to have that common standard, because we like it or not, we follow rules, and we have the incentives and the penalties, and that's what we're used to as a human race, basically, to follow and guide. So I think those guidelines have to be there, and but I think that's when then the banks and all the financial institutions have a role to play, and I think it's your fiduciary duty to walk them through that and steering them in the right direction with the best practice, and just helping them out effectively.
If I can jump in.
Of course.
Also, with the central bank stress testing the bank portfolios, that helps reinforce that as well. And what we found on that was it was a very good discussion between the banking community about the credit. It wasn't a punitive discussion. It was really about, this is how you need to be thinking about it. So I think the banking community really is getting really on top of this. Transparency is becoming much more important. And in terms of, I guess, looking at the amount of money available as well, as these things become more evident or self-evident, which companies are moving faster and moving along towards a transition, which ones aren't. Fund flows will follow that. I mean, in the G20, we're doing some work. There's roughly 120 trillion of institutional investor money out there. That's sovereign wealth funds, insurance company pension funds, things of that sort. And that money is going to start moving as we continue to start defining green better, putting more regulatory and legislative structure around it. So I think there's going to be a great opportunity for those that are moving and demonstrating that they're moving, as well as both not just complying with regulatory, not only complying with that, but also they'll see the funding and the financing, and banks will be there to provide that funding for their growth, for their CapEx, for their R&D.
Thank you. And so, Viveka, I mean, do you see this? Do you see best practices in the Nordics and elsewhere being too loose, or how do you see the greenwashing debate at the moment?
I think we are past the days of greenwashing. You won't you're not, a company or an institution would not be able, to just put up the nice words and package it rightly. Sustainability must be integrated, and all the aspects, the E, the S's, and the G's. And you must really show that you take it an integrated approach to sustainability, and you must also, in a transparent way, also when things are not moving your way, report and communicate on the development. The financial market has this extremely crucial role of being the catalyst of driving. And, for the financial market to be able to take on that role, you need transparency from the corporates, you need standards, and it must be true impact, it must be real. Nobody will get away with greenwashing from now on.
And Jonathan, any comment from the sort of municipal side? I guess.
Well, I think agree with the comments around sort of standardizing. Is one of the things we're doing with our kind of Climate OS platform, is trying to give a common methodology and rigor, but also to make them transparent and verifiable, both to aid the kind of collective work, but also for others to scrutinize. There's things like the science-based targets approach that's out there. The big city networks are also really pushing transparency. The CDP platform, which both cities and the corporate side. I think there's unintentional greenwashing that maybe has happened previously, just because people weren't really aware of the challenge and made the commitments. There's always this big gap between action and rhetoric. We've seen that at international level as well, where the policies and the actual commitments have to follow through to the words. But I think the transparency can also be a friend. I think politically it can be difficult to open up and show you don't have all the answers, but when you do so with others, and it's just part of the kind of the standards of what you're working towards, then I think actually it gives you a way to collaborate more effectively and share the learning with other cities, and that's what we're finding increasingly in working together in that way. So yeah, there may still be occasional claims here and there, but no one can hide from this agenda. So I think it's definitely in the right direction.
May I add something? It's just in terms of this is where the banks come in, or the advisors, whatever that form it takes, because those guys are having access to the deal flow, to transactions, and to other corporates and sectors, SSAs and everything. So that's the learnings that you can bring into the corporate space. So it's very interesting to see how the corporates learn when they engage into the process, how much they learn every time, because they don't expect how everything is going to be linked within the organization itself. When you start talking about the business units and the operational unit, or just the documentation, so that's when they start connecting the dots. And it's the role of the advisors effectively to be kind of their friend, but the uncomfortable friend at times, asking the difficult questions, being the devil's advocate, and that's just to prepare them for the questions that they will get with investors or other stakeholders later on. So that's the role. When the way we see it is, we always tell our corporates, don't go with the yes, say yes. Go to those banks that are friends of yours, but uncomfortable devil advocate. That's what you want.
Exactly. And sorry, were you gonna?
Well, just something to kind of respond on the city side as well, that engaging in trying to secure finance for things like, again, I mentioned sort of the green mortgages, the retrofit, other forms of transport, and looking at things like asset-backed securities and things like that, which is probably a big area of potential for cities. The requirements on the evidence base, the requirements in designing the programs ahead of time, are completely changing the standards within cities for their general planning. So I think there's a lot of learning that's coming into cities from trying to access those capital markets.
That's great, and then that's what we're seeing with our clients on the corporate side, exactly. The sustainability team talking to the treasury team, talking to the management, and it's the first time they've even really had that discussion, which is fantastic, and it's great that works in the same way in the municipalities. Well, Viveka, I mean, you mentioned ESG, and I think we've talked mainly about the E side. Maybe we should just talk a little bit about social. Oh, sorry, was there a question? Yes. Sorry, it's hard to see anything.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Martinez. I'm from Clotavade, and we mobilize institutional capital for impact. And going back to the questions that you asked about greenwashing, if I put my trustee hat on, there is a big difference between public companies and private companies. On the public companies, ESG and impact is all about one thing, which is risk and reporting. So the non-being transparent is almost an impossibility for the public market. For the private market, here comes the challenges, and here comes where the advisors help and the value chain works, etc., etc. But to say that there are no standards and no taxonomies, that's not true, because like Michael was explaining, you have the TCFD, you have taxonomies, you have several ways of doing that, and in the meanwhile, NEDs and trustees are getting constantly educated what are the obligations regarding climate change, ESG, or impact. So as of the 1st of October, for instance, it's going to be regulatory demanded by all pension funds within the UK and Ireland to disclose TCFD, for instance. And so it is coming. So I think the greenwashing side, it's part of the past. We have the UNPRI, we heard SEBs, they have their own standards. The question remains now, it is that the companies who are in transition, they are not publicly traded. It is like, how do we assist them to get forward in ESG? You can't have an ESG policy without having 3 years of reporting. I mean, there's so much to be involved with that. So I think it is more or less what can the banks, SEB or Bank of England or investor, assist in that to hurry up advisors like you and other corporate finance houses in investment banks and so on.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I think the larger public companies are very open to scrutiny as the private ones that needs to change. I don't know if anyone wants to make any comments on that.
I can just, no, sorry, Michael, you go ahead.
Well, we can both do it. I mean, I think, to be fair, the private companies are getting much bigger. 20 years ago, private equity used to buy companies for a few $100 million. Now they're buying publicly listed companies and listing them. So there's a couple ways that they're getting under, they're getting scrutiny. One is through the banking system. So again, it's the supervisors and the central banks who are looking at the portfolios of the banks. So they are lending to these large private equity firms. So they see that and what they're lending in. Additionally, on TCFD and a lot of the other initiatives, there's a lot of discussion about not just, initially it was about publicly traded companies, but now there's a lot of discussion around the size of a company, whether it's public or private. So it'll start, I think there's a real recognition, and you really nailed an important point. There's a lot of private companies, a lot of large ones that kind of were able to evade this for the last few years, but they're getting on board a little bit because they can see it coming. B, they can see through the regulator's eye, through the bank portfolios. And then finally, because of their size now, I think they will be getting captured in the TCFDs and the taxonomies as well. Viveka, over to you.
No, I will just, connect with what you're saying. And I think I can just, use Investor AB as an example. We are lead owners in listed companies, but we also have a portfolio of wholly owned subsidiaries, which are not then listed. And what we do as an owner, we set targets, and we are very vocal about what we expect from the company. So that's also one way. And we are one owners, and there are other owners and private equity firms, as Michael is bringing up. So that's one way also for the non-listed or the non-public companies. And then again, the banking system. Even if you are not listed or you're a very small company, you usually have you have a relationship with the bank, and the banks have to be transparent. The banks have to secure that they don't sit with stranded assets in a few decades ahead. So we are getting there, I think. But there is a big difference, I agree with you, between publicly listed and non-listed companies in terms of transparency, and also how used you are to being transparent and do reporting. But it's changing.
Yeah, just one thing, just to add, it's effectively to the private companies, because we deal with them, with those companies, and often, and we look after some of those investments from financial sponsors. So those financial sponsors, if you jointly own some assets, you have so many different interests. But now the project companies, they need to follow the guidelines, and there's less greenwashing, because they need to embrace it, because the ultimate beneficial owners, they need to report themselves. So we're looking after those private companies, but when it comes to the smaller companies, they don't have the resources in many cases to throw to the reporting, monitoring, or going through the processes, and that's another challenge.
Exactly to your point, those beneficial owners who invest in the private equity firms themselves are large pension funds, insurance companies who have very, very strong ESG ethos. So they're getting, great question, and certainly they've gotten away for a while, but the doors are closing on it from a variety of angles.
And that definitely tallies with my experience of private equity companies, even in their own funding, having KPIs, et cetera, wanting to be the greenest private equity fund out there, et cetera. So no, but it's a broad market, and it sounds from this last debate that it's the bankers who have to be the policemen, Renato.
Well, we're here to help.
Well, I think we're out of time, and you're probably all getting very thirsty. So I'd just like to thank the panel very much. Oh, maybe questions quickly. Do we have time for questions?
One more.
One question.
Yes, one.
Thank you. Just a quick, easy question, I think. How long until green finance will just become finance?
It's a very good question. Who wants to start on that one? Michael, you?
I can give you your hard stop date. I gave it already, which is roughly 2050. But I suspect this has been a really, really traumatic year. People around the world watch their houses burn, their cars get washed away. I think there's a real public push as well. Many people have thought about climate change as something that's 20, 30, 40 years away, around the time of net zero coming into place. But I'm very optimistic that the attention has been both within the public sector, the private sector, and I'm hoping exactly, I remember talking to Mark Carney 6 years ago, we talked about green finance just will be finance. And I'm hoping that we see that happening in the next 5 to 10 years.
Anyone else like to comment? Renato?
Well, I would just say that hopefully it happens soon, but I think it's still a long way that it comes to be, with the leader green and everything becomes sustainable. I think it's a long way.
I think the same thing applies for cities as well. There's this moving away from not just the focus on the things that we are doing right, but also the things that you're doing wrong and capturing those and rewriting the rules of the game effectively. So you can't have other decisions elsewhere which are still investing or promoting things which are against the trajectory we're going. So it's not just in support of, but it's capturing all of those activities at the same time.
Viveka, a last word?
No, I think, of course, we're not there yet, but over time. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we get there sooner than what we think maybe today.
Perfect. Well, I think on that note, we'll finish. So just a very large thank you to our panelists for a very interesting debate.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the panel. Thank you, Michael, who I know is joining us from France, and Viveka from Stockholm. I think that's a really helpful way to finish the day. Money will lead the way, doesn't it always? It's time for us to sum up.